Hey everybody, what's up? It's Booksy. Today is Saturday, July 22nd. Some really big news, I guess, for AMC is the major after hours movement that occurred due to the court settlement results. Basically, the judge rejected the settlement. Doesn't mean conversion won't happen, just means that the settlement, which was going to add shares basically it was an offering to people who held shares, giving them additional shares. That has been rejected. And I'm not going to get into what that necessarily means going forward. There's a lot that needs to be digested, and there's a lot of people who are spreading misinformation. Some people were talking about it being conversion, being rejected, and that's not quite right. It doesn't seem to pertain to that. It really was about that settlement. And I don't know exactly what else to take from it, but I do think that there was a very telling kind of statement that was made, which was anything that's good for APE seems to be bad for AMC. Anything that's good for AMC seems to be bad for APE. So it's interesting. The stocks are supposed to be, supporting one another, and I actually think it's probably just due to the nature of it, but also, the arbitrages we've seen going on that there's a clear yin-yang with it, and that's just kind of the way it's been set up. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm going to dig into technical analysis. I'm going to stay there for the rest of the video. I'm not going to speculate too much on anything to do with the AA company. It's not really my wheelhouse in terms of fundamentals. I have opinions, but I'm not going to be a talking head for that today. So here's where we're going to start. Basically, I did this chart a little while ago. I called it the Keep It Simple chart. What I did is I was trying to show that these are shrinking iterative models and that they were going to a place that is consistent with what we see in the master fractal, as I call it. The master fractal is this guy right here, and it's a fractal that goes way back and stretches all the way back to December. It was right here, and it was December in this area. It was one of the earliest kind of revelations that I had, and eventually I went back and I just kept adding to it, and I took away from it, and eventually came up with what I called the master fractal, which is a series of shrinking sine waves, basically. And what they do is they shrink, but they also iterate, meaning that they have the same motion on different time frames, and you start seeing that. So that's fractal analysis 101 in a lot of ways, is that any kind of a fractal analysis should involve iteration because it's the pattern in which the stock is trading, right? It's that simple. But what's the point of it? Well, the point is always to go through and grab liquidity. On Friday, I was working on another chart, and I was talking about how AMC was practicing Shiko, which is like the sumo art of building leg strength. And it's essentially was building strength down here. It's been doing it for a long time, this very sideways action. And that's not a bad thing. That's actually what happens at the end of the master fractal is you get that consolidation, and then there's a move, usually in the end, towards like a center liquidity. And in this case, it went back and checked an original top, and then it took off. And I was talking about how even on the micro, if you look over here on this little area that's called Mark 6, you can see it's crossed over that level and found support. And it's also very similarly set up as one of the initial preliminary supply points, really preliminary support and supply, but it's set up as one of the initial places that you're going to have resistance when you drop down, right, and sell off. Well, we've done that a number of times on AMC. We've dropped down and come back up and checked it and then come back up again and failed. And we've done it on diagonals. We've done it on horizontals. I've got a number of charts that kind of illustrate that. I've talked about this hundreds of times. I mean, and like I even did a fractal video about it, or a final macro video, and I said, I'm not going to do any more because it's just going to keep shrinking. And that's kind of exactly what happened. When we look into this and we look at closely, yeah, like when we're zoomed out, we can see the big picture kind of matches. There's some parts here that seem to be fairly similar, in style. But it's also in these M shapes, right, jumping over these creeks. And it's also getting to the point where it's starting to look a little bit like this final area. When you look left to right here, and it's pretty close to 1-to-1. You get this final bounce, and then there's that last push up, There's this consolidating sideways action before a final drop. And that was what I was expecting. It looks almost perfect right here up to the end of Mark 9. It looks about to where I've got this 0.75 marked off. But then what happens is that it comes low and it didn't go lower. And the question was, is it going to have an LPS or is it going to have a spring? When I made this chart originally, we hadn't even made that move just yet. I knew we were going to make a hook, a hooking action. I'm going to use the Discord image for it. This is what I thought may occur because I was like, well, we might come back up first and check, or we could always come back and check later. But it made sense to me that we would probably come up and check first. I call it the alternate scenario because it was kind of in the middle, where you're not really like making a certain move right away. You're kind of just coasting up and then down. Really similar to what happened. It happened a little bit faster in real time, and then it came back down. And I said that if it were going to make a spring, it's probably going to be in the 330s to 350s. And if it was going to make an LPS mid-June, we probably would hit around 4, and it would at least fill that gap. That's what happened. It hit in mid-June. We look back, and you can see that it came down in mid-June. About June 22nd, it coasted into this bottom. It was really the end of June before it really got to that low, and then ultimately it did dip again in July. So timing wasn't the best on this for sure, and I wasn't necessarily anticipating a huge run on Friday. I think Bam is the only one that probably could take credit for saying he thought it was going to melt up to $8 all of a sudden, but that's okay. You know, I wasn't looking for that because I was looking for something more steady. But yeah, it's all there. You can see that we jumped this local creek on that last shrinking iteration here. There's a smaller iteration again. It almost looks like the same thing all over again. But this time, instead of kind of getting truncated and dropping again for a new low, which is what I was talking about on Friday, we just kind of took off, and that LPS was present, and it did jump from middle liquidity. You can see the high liquidity. It's right where that red line is. That's the most traded region at 434, and that's where it took off from. This is a significant spot for a lot of other reasons, and we'll get to that later. Oddly, the measurement that I did on the estimated timing for this, which was July 19th, is really close to when we took off. So it's really bizarre. I was expecting there to be another reset, basically, by this point in time. And it looks like, at least for the most part, that may be the case, that it might be a change of character. And really the only thing that was required for the change of character in my mind was to make a higher high finally. We have yet to make a higher high ever since first starting to come down. So this is a really big deal. And all of that being said, even though we jumped not only one but two creeks, right? The creek that started in August and hit on February, but then also the creeks that are apparent coming down from February to May to June, we jumped those. And you can see right where it grabbed off on that last one and pushed over. It didn't, in my opinion, jump one of these the most outer creeks that we have. And it's a little bit confusing because if you look at, and we're going to look at one more chart for AMC specifically, and it's got a little bit of a different story, which is sort of like this. And it makes it look like, well, yeah, it's gapped up way above that creek. But then you also have to say that this also went above, and this also went above. And the thing is in a creek, anytime you make a high above that creek line, you're pushing that creek up. So in theory, probably one of the most accurate creeks that you could make would be this guy right here, which is sort of a cross section that kind of pivots right around August. And we did peak above it, but then we kind of slid back down. So it's still that same pocket. It just so happens that doing it this way, right, with these final two cat ears driving towards August top, that you get a really clean hit. You also get a really clean hit right here on another intersection. I've got it drawn on another chart, but if you take this guy up, you can see that's also a really clean intersection. It's nearly the same as the parallels, not quite. This was a much flatter area. It didn't follow the parallels. If you drew a parallel here, like the other ones, you can see it didn't quite ever reach it. It got really close. And the reason that I got that 575 was because the parallel that touched this bottom also touched that bottom, okay? The point being that it's not exactly super consistent, but if you look at that, I think it's hard to argue that that's a very clear intersection of a lot of things. So surprised, yeah, of course. Happy, yeah. I mean, I think it made a higher high. It pushed higher than it did in February. It jumped over creeks. It pushed higher than it did here, and really that was enough for me in May. At this point, what can't happen, and what I mean by can't is that you don't want it to happen. What you don't want to see is you don't want to see this come all the way back down, for sure. And then really, ideally, you don't want it to go below about 50% of that move, because that's typically very distributive. So if it's got strength and it's going to go, I would say that right here, kind of where it's at, really this pocket from, we'll say 650, 636 up to $8, it needs to hold this pocket and then push to the upside. You need to see a consolidation right here and then a push to the upside. All right. So I'm going to hop charts quite a bit today. Oopsie. We're going to look at a couple different things because I've had a lot of charts, right? Not anything else on this one. I've had a lot of charts, and there's a lot that could be kind of talked about. And I feel like I would do myself a bit of a disservice to not talk about those things. So you can see that some of the earliest projections I had were based around that early July to mid-July push. Instead, what we got is a really clean creek cross, and I was kind of waiting for that retest. I don't think it happened right here, but it did check on that main level at 420, 419, and I've been talking about that quite a bit as well because it was just a really critical level going backwards in time. This is kind of one of the messiest charts I have. But remember, we were talking about this, and I said it needs to jump over this pink guy. And once it does that, in my opinion, it's kind of changed as long as it holds. Okay, as long as it holds. So same deal. I think you got that leap, and I think if it holds, then it's in a really strong position. It jumped over this one and that one. All right, so it looks really good. Now I'm going to look at both the charts that I've got here. We'll come back to this one in just a second. There's not as much to see on that one. It's just a little bit cleaner. This was a macro chart where I was looking at these parallels and how absolutely ridiculously consistent they have been ever since the beginning of this stock's price movement, and how they favored it. And I've also been looking at this and talking about how there was a high probability that we would jump off of the green, which is the 50% marker. And this is the one that I said, hey, if you drew a channel, and I said I would do it later, it almost doesn't really matter. It almost doesn't look like the creek at all. Well, this one would definitely be out of it, right? So it hit 875 or so. It would definitely be on the outside of that downward channel. Just like it did in 2020, we bounced kind of right off of that 50% mark, and we didn't make a lower low. We just failed to do so. So we kind of climbed back up. There was no extra drop except for that little after hours dip on July 10th, and it just kind of stood. Whether or not this is going to hold up, whole nother story, right? Whole nother question. Is it going to hold? Is it going to sell off? We're going to have to wait and see. But I think it's pretty clear to me right now that it met the criteria. Like it wrapped its little finger around that midline, and it looks like it's pushing off in much the same way. If you recall, this push-off wasn't some massive gap. It was a series of LPSs, and I was talking about this on Friday before I lost internet for about 12 hours, believe it or not, and I didn't even know this happened until late last night, about midnight. And we were talking about how it took like almost a week plus to really form these SOSs and stuff. And that was a big deal. Our LPSs, coming up here is like walking out of that was a big deal on that final jump. There were checks. There were checks on every creek cross. There were a lot of gaps. I think there's something like 14 to 20 something gaps to way up here. I would not be lying if I said I wasn't excited about this, but I also have to say that it's a little odd because it happened in after hours, and it's a little disconcerting because while I've been talking about pumping up to like $20 to $23 and then coming back down to $15, this has been my thesis for a long, long time, right? Was that we would come back up here and basically come back. And we talked about this in terms of, the slingshot moves and so on and so forth. But it's so similar as well to previous moves that we've made that it bears repeating. The thing is we didn't have some kind of massive, 60 some odd % gap or something. You know what I mean? Like, it's a pretty significant move, and there's danger in that. There's times where you can do that kind of a breakaway and just go if the volume's there, and there's plenty of times where it's just going to come right back and fill it up. And that gap to $8 could be, we're going to chop back all the way back down, at some point in the future. Into November or something, and then you end up, you know what I mean? Like, that's not out of the question. So I can have both opinions right now. I know that seems like they're contradictory, but you have to just sort of wait, because we need to see it gain support. If it doesn't gain support and push over what I think is like the penultimate top creek, which we just barely tapped in after hours, if it doesn't even hold support on like this guy, for example, on this channel, coming back down, I really don't want to see it go below like 650, if it's going to hold. So that's problematic, because we have potentially a massive gap, right? As long as the price action holds going into Monday and it doesn't just sell back down. So that's a big deal, Beyond that, I don't think there's much else to see on this chart. I will say that, when we're looking at those 50% levels, there's probably better charts for it anyways that I've got. So we're going to kind of defer to those. And this is one of those charts where I've got, in my opinion, like there's a little bit of a mess here, but we definitely have those 50% levels. And you can see that we came right up underneath into the pocket on this one. Again, this is the one that we were talking about with the slingshots. You're going to have like 50-50 moves, right? 50%, 50%. Assuming this, is roughly over. I mean, it could come up again and maybe distribute again above 9, but roughly that's where you would see it. In theory, based on the slingshot model, the first move would be at 50% around this top right here at like 609 or 610. It's a little hard for me to draw it right now because I don't have any snapping on or anything. So it's kind of an estimation, but that would be a perfect 50-50 on that slingshot. So mathematically, that's a really simple measurement, and it looks correct. So in theory, that could be the big first move, and then there could be a chopping period, and then you get a big secondary move. The secondary move, if you recall, it has a lot to do with arcs, and it has a lot to do with momentum, but ultimately, usually what we see is that the secondary move, it pushes up far, and then it comes back and consolidates along the next top. Where is the next top? Where is the next liquid floor? This is a trickier question. I think, again, you're looking at that 673, 674 area as a possible candidate. It's a very difficult thing to judge because in this area, it was very clear, right? It's really evident where that top is, and that's exactly where it stops. In our particular example, I think you'd have to use these two tops together. You know what I mean? So it's sort of a bit of a catch-all. And I'm not looking at fibs. I'm sure there's some fibs around here as well that we could probably look at. But I would say that the region from probably to these tops, and I know it's a very large area, but I would think this is where you'd want to see that consolidation, because previously this was what? Supply, right? Supply, even here, supply, upper supply, 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 supply. So in my opinion, the next big thing for us is going to need to be, again, from about 650 up to that 850, 840 area. You really need to now have this turn into demand. I think you need to see it kind of have a little bit of a shakeout. The weekends are going to sell off a bit. It can't sell too far, but it needs to kind of have that nice sell off, and then you should see another push up. From that point forward, things are a little different because you can use the bottommost move here, which is what I did previously in this area to get that 50-50 move. So that's going to look a little bit bigger, not significantly, but it will be a much larger move. So remember 380 kept coming up a lot, and now we're kind of looking at it. It's like pretty interesting. And you can see that this gives you a lot of possibility, right? Because you have a pretty big range here. I'm thinking, again, that $19 because it's going to come up to that next level. I really do think that's where it's heading. That's the next 50% marker. It's up here, right in that pocket. And we've been talking about that for a long time coming. Hasn't happened yet, but it's been absolutely something that has been on our, our mind is coming up to maybe about $19 to $21, maybe even up to 23 if it gets a crazy extension. And then ultimately, where is it going to come back? Well, that's the tricky thing is I think it comes back to about $15 and trades this range. And a lot of that has to do with liquidity. So the way I had drawn the charts previously in another macro videos, I probably would have drawn a lot more checks here, right? I wouldn't have had it come straight up, but I would have had it come up here and then basically chop. And then your second major chop area would be somewhere around here, and it would probably even extend backwards. And what is that exactly? Well, there's a lot of things that would entail, and it could even be a really significant drop. But one of the biggest things was what we just talked about a minute ago, which was the outermost creek break. And I think from that point of view, and you can kind of see what I mean by how, it's pretty far up there, this little pocket. If you were to come back and check that, that is a big drop, right? But it's an important one because this particular jump over that creek, very similar to what happened in January. That January one had a huge pullback, but it had to show that, it was a big backup, but it showed that, you were going to come back. And point in case, these are my 50% markers, that we've had on the chart for a while, and I was showing the divisions. Back in the January model here, you can see that huge pullback, right, that occurred, and it does come significantly low. And ultimately, did it come all the way back down to check this? No, but it does check here, and this ends up being, if you look backwards, this ends up being roughly where that creek is, okay? So I would expect there to be some kind of a major pullback after we went up high. Now, all of this is like bullish talk, and you can talk about this and just sort of have that expectation that this is a possibility, but it's not over until it's over, right? Until you see that hold or above 650, and until you see that consolidation and then that secondary push, it's not over. There's always a possibility that if it distributes right here, we're just going to work our way slowly back down, or even fast, I guess. We'll work our way all the way back down to where we just gapped up from. APE is a big player in this, as you all know. APE had a really different night last night. So APE got a massive drop. And I had talked right before the stream went out, I had talked about this coming down. And I said, if we're looking at where is it consolidating, it's consolidating around 164. It seems to be a really pivotal level. And obviously it was sitting there for a long time. Well, this is a big problem, right? This is a huge sell-off and then a huge buy back up. APE didn't drop significantly and hold the drop. It dropped significantly and then it got bought back up. You might say that it could be just Antara, being like, all right, I'm just done with this, out. But there's other things here that kind of are curious. It came back down to nearly where that gap was in after hours at 67 cents. When it came back up, where did it come back to? 153, just below the liquid floor that we were talking about. It's in a peculiar spot right now, and I think that it's hard for me anyways to say, this is what AMC is going to do without even considering at this point what's APE doing. I don't think beyond what we know right now that there's much else to say. I think that this probably is the major check. To me, if I'm being completely honest,
where my black notebook is?
I'll help you in a minute. This to me still looks a lot like those cat ears, like 1 and then 2. And this could be a spring opportunity, where it's come down to check something and we'll see. You know, there's a whole lot of things that could happen in the next coming weeks and months. But you can tell that going from April, you know, March 15th when Tara got to get their sell on, to that big buy-in in April, and then now those are the main pillars. I think those are the ones that you've got perhaps a change of operators. Even there's a silent player here, I believe, that's not Antara. I really do, because there's somebody that's buying against them, right? And it's not just retail, in my opinion. Further evidence for this, all right? When you look at the combo chart, this is crazy. Okay, we talked about this yesterday, oddly, because we were talking about this, these parallels, and I said, you know, you've got this kind of outer creek, and I guess I'm kind of fudging the line right there, but you've got this outer creek, and it seems to me that this, if it is a diamond, right, that this kind of just coasted sideways out of the diamond. This doesn't look anything like the other two charts. This looks like a double shakeout, right? It looks like it shook out downward and then went all the way back up. What's weird about this is when you look at the combination price, and this again being like a baseline value, this dropped all the way down to $2. It did actually go low. And I think that it's not quite, but it's very close to being an actual kind of spring bottom. It went really low. So that's kind of fascinating. And this is right where my original target was, which is also weird, right? Because I was thinking that up here, when it jumped over, it might go ahead and slide back down. Instead, it went sideways, eked out, faced this kind of midline crisis here, and then dropped really far. Weird stuff, though. I didn't move this just because I was like, whatever. I mean, it's there. I'm looking at it, and I also did yesterday. We were talking about the diamond target, and I said, well, it should break out, right, and hit that target. So the area in which it breaks out from the diamond, right, looking at the original drop into where I think the original liquidity center is, you know, and it's hard to draw it. I said maybe right around there. That's kind of right where it went to. It was really close. Again, this to me looks like a massive cat ear that then has this big dump to check that bottom, and then it just immediately returns, which is a good thing, because that could be more like the actual spring bottom that we were looking for. This kind of emotion right here, right at the end. I mean, this looks almost exactly like it, which is kind of crazy. Again, did I think it was going to happen in like an hour? No. You know, even this, which was an after hours move, still took 2 or 3 hours in that morning to push back. But that dip is very similar in terms of like coming back down to hit that bottom, which is what we're seeing right here. We're coming back down to that low area. So my hope is that it does hold and we do continue to get that push. But man, oh man, these charts could not be more different from one another in that regard. This really looks like it spans almost the entire range that had been traded. APE looks like it has this massive drop and then a buy back in. And then, of course, AMC just looks like it took off. The last chart, and it's not the least, but the last chart I want to talk about is this darn deviation chart. So the deviation chart is off the chain here, interesting, because of all the ones that we were looking at, this is most consistent. You won't find these markers set up in this way on the other charts. You won't find them. They don't exist. When you go back and you look at this, it's only this consistent. It's only this clean when you look at this chart. And this is the deviation, how far you are away from that other chart we just looked at, which is the baseline. And we talked about how if it were going to go together, if prices were coming together, this would drop. And it was actually a descending, almost like a descending triangle up until recently. And it just never came back and tested that bottom again. But it stayed low for like a month. And it's the longest we've ever been that low of a deviation, meaning APE and AMC were really close together. This price action isn't really price action. It's about, again, how far they are away from each other. And look, they go from being really close together to all of a sudden being really far apart and then kind of settling in above the 271, which is a mirror of the low average is what I've got down here. So it's a mirror right around that 186 value. So if you look at this bracket here, here's what I mean. the distance that this traveled right there, and you take it back down to like roughly where that 186 center is, and you'll see what I mean. Like it's this kind of equal parts move. And it's really interesting to me looking at it now, because even if, and I have my own skepticisms about this particular chart. It's not like, again, everything has to be perfect. But this one has been perhaps one of the most predictive charts that we've had. And it's not even like, it's just their relationship between the two. It's basically an arbitrage chart for that reason. And it has to do with the market weighted average and value. In my opinion, this one doesn't make me feel quite as good as the others do, because this one has that same kind of massive move that we've seen previously that has resulted in a sell-off. I think the biggest difference being, of course, the amount of time that this stayed in this range, which is just a really long time, ever since August. And then, of course, finally getting to that breakout. But it really exhausted pretty much that entire triangle, didn't it? I mean, it went all the way to the very end. And it's just fascinating to me. So again, if the deviation were going to come back to normal, now it's completely the opposite. It was before that it would have to travel to the upside, meaning the deviation has to increase. Now it's the opposite. The deviation would have to decrease. That means that, again, in the past, what that's usually meant is that AMC sells off and APE rises. But these were $4 rises, right, in AMC, here, 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 and almost here. We've got something very similar to that right now with another $4 rise. So is it kicking the can, where we're going to see the same kind of thing and it's going to walk all the way back down? Or is this going to be the major change that we've been waiting for? Are we going to see AMC sort of take off, with APE lag behind? It's a difficult one to answer. It really is. I don't know for sure yet. I haven't been able to kind of wrap my brain around that part of it just yet. I'm trying to think of that in relationship to the court news and what that could mean for settlements and really, what that means for the future of conversion and all that stuff. If the settlement is rejected, it's kicking the can, and it means that people that own APE aren't going to see that turn into AMC immediately, because the settlement would have finished it, right? Would have finished the lawsuit and ultimately meant that, okay, you could just move forward with whatever. So at this point, I guess my initial assumption is that you're not moving forward, right? So while I think there's some good to this, I also think that there could also be some really, really major arbitrage at play going forward. And I think we're just going to have to wait and see for what it's worth, what that means, basically. It may not mean anything. It could be super, super significant. But I haven't really wrapped my brain around it yet. I just wanted to share this with you because of all the charts, this one has been probably the most consistent, and it's just a relationship chart, It's really fascinating. So that's all I got for you today. I know it was a little bit much, hopefully shorter than, some of my other videos, but big picture, just final recap here. Yeah, you pushed up. I think you've hit one of the major creeks. I think you're kind of hitting another cross trend. I think it's got that extension that it needs. It got that higher high. It has to hold. It could have up to a 50% retrace and still hold, potentially. If we get to that 50% mark on that move and you see that buy back in, that's fine. It could be like an SOS, but ultimately I think you really don't want it to go back below like 650. Like it needs to settle above there. And if it does, I think we're in a better position to say, yeah, it's going to continue potentially all the way up to the next move. The next move, I think, goes all the way up to that $19 to $21 range and then pulls back to somewhere around 15 or 16. Could be a little bit lower. But I think that's sort of the gist of it. You could see that final that like what I call the worst case scenario, which was that this is some kind of distribution again. And that has to do with this being a potentially like large, fake out, if you want to call it that. I'm not so sure about that just yet. I want to make sure that I don't overspeak on that part. It really would look kind of like a mirror of what we see over here in some ways. Maybe it wouldn't be that dramatic, but that's the only thing I can think that would be kind of negative would be a rejection here that then distributes and then starts going down and forming like another buy-in. Long term, that could be really bullish, but short term, it would be pretty painful, and it could end up making a really long-winded secondary, reaccumulation. And that's kind of what we see sometimes, when you have that first push and then you get that second push and it looks like it's going to go moonshot, right? And you're just coming out of a bridge and then you end up doing another consolidation. And in our case, I think that it's a possibility. It's not inevitable, okay? So I just wanted you to keep that in mind. I'm not at that point where I'm saying that's going to happen just yet, but it's definitely a possibility. Usually, yeah, and this is the only thing that kind of makes me kind of worried at this very moment is that usually that secondary push, and I don't want to go too deep into this, but usually that secondary push is a hook on this trend. So we do see that as a possible consistency, that you're seeing that push up and it's really just like a bridge action. You've got this really long, like tall winded bottom bridge, but then if that push up came and exceeds it, well, this exceeded it as well right here. It went over the high, but it ultimately was that cross section on that sine wave. So it came up and bonked its head and didn't move forward. So you don't want to see that, where it's coming up and bonking its head, on that sine wave, and then it doesn't move forward. Whereas this could be that drop-in value, like here. This would be that secondary buy up, right, where it's coming back up and you're getting that strength test, and then you've got this accumulation period down bottom in a low area. Then you've got a major spring action into like a Mark 7, and you may be stuck, right? Now, I think some people are going to look at this and say, well, Booksy, kind of looks like what just happened right here, man. And I'm like, yep, kind of does, outside of this coming lower in the middle. But so, what's to say it doesn't just do that kind of action? Well, it could, and that's the other thing that's why I don't want to overspeak about it, because that final action, much like what happened in January, could be more or less like a reaccumulation. It doesn't necessarily have to always be, it's got to come all the way back down. Sometimes it does, right? And if it does, okay. But it could be like, it doesn't have to come all the way back down. But it could be something that's a lot more, let's just say, benign, where it ends up being like this kind of pocketed thing and then going. Okay, and would take a while. So I would just say for Monday, just be realistic about it. Don't get too far ahead just yet. If you're making money on it, make money on it. Don't be greedy. And I can't give you financial advice, but I'm not going to be greedy about it. I'm going to watch those levels. I'm going to re-enter if I feel like it's good re-entry at like a 50% pullback or something, or if I see that it's forming a reaccumulation. But each one of these is an opportunity to kind of work the next stage, work the next step. So just heads up about that possibility, because I do worry that a lot of people are going to be like buying in, and it's really it might just be sitting here for a little bit. So we've also got an earnings date coming up. And it could be that is part of the move, where you're going to see this kind of chop and then push up into earnings, but it could also be a catalyst for some other move. Like chops into earnings and then drops. You know what I mean? Like that would be another way this could play out. So far, good. Very good. I think it's a really positive sign. It happened when I wasn't expecting it. That's okay. That's life. There's things that we talked about that were spot on. There's some things that were like, meh, I was waiting to see if that spring happened, and it just didn't ever happen. So if we're not going to get it, we're not going to get it. I'm not going to cry about it and worry about it. We're just going to move forward. It is what it is, right? And we've talked about the other scenario, which is the LPS. Seems to be the way it's going. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will catch up with you all next week.